Lesson number 1 of your second term online English language class. I'm your teacher, Miss Rabia Javed, and today we are going to start off with Unit 3. This time, I have selected for you a different kind of writing style in literature. We're going to do a piece of poetry today. In today's lesson, we will learn from page 62 to 65 of your Oxford Progressive English. We're going to study a different kind of writing, which is poetry. We'll understand the meaning of and interpret the text. We're going to identify and understand meanings of words and expressions as usual. We're going to explore textual clues and cues as well this time, since this is poetry. Poetry needs a lot of details. It gives you a lot of clues, hence this particular objective. And finally, we're going to identify and learn the use of archaic language. Today's poem is quite interesting. And again, if you have heard of The Daffodils, which is by William Wordsworth, our poet today is also from the same era. Our poet is Walter de la Mare. He was born in 1873 and passed away in 1959. Walter de la Mare was born on April 25th, 1873 in London. He's considered as one of the modern literature's chief exemplars of the Romantic imagination. His complete works form a sustained treatment of romantic themes. Romantic over here means from the Romantic era of literature. Romantic era basically pertains to things that were closer to nature, that expressed emotions, okay? And the themes in those eras were dreams, death, rare state of mind and emotion, fantasy worlds of childhood, and the pursuit of transcendent. That is, where humans come from. Upon graduation, Walter de la Mare went to work for the Anglo-American Standard Oil Company, remaining with the firm for 18 years. Roughly around the age of 30, his life changed. De la Mare began writing short stories and poetry while working as a bookkeeper in the company's London office during the 1890s. His first published short story, titled Kismet, appeared in the journal Sketch in 1895. In 1902, he published his first major work, which was the poetry collection titled Songs of Childhood. It was recognized as a significant example of children's literature for its creative imagery and variety of meters. Variety of meters means how the poems were of different lengths, different lines, okay? In 1908, upon publishing the poetry collection, the second set of poetry collection titled Poems, de la Mare was granted a civil list pension, enabling him to terminate his corporate employment and focus exclusively on writing. Since the government gave him pension, he could now pay full attention to his work. Our poet died on June 22nd, 1956, and he was honored for his remarkable contribution in English literature by being buried at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Now, the historical context of the poem. Walter de la Mare published The Listeners in 1912 as the title poem of his second collection of the poetry. It remains as one of his most famous pieces of writing and reflects the author's fascination with mystery and the supernatural. The poem tells the story of an unnamed traveler approaching an abandoned house seemingly inhabited by ghosts, but leaves the readers many questions as to who these entities actually are unanswered. Walter de la Mare's famous poem, The Listener, immediately grabs the reader's attention with its sense of atmosphere from the very first line. It's a moonlit night, deep in a forest. A traveler knocks insistently on the door of a lone house. Although there is no response inside a house of phantom, inside a traveler knocks insistently on the door of a lone house. Although there is no response, inside, a host of phantom listeners hear the traveler's call. Spooked by the silence, the man knocks even louder. He calls out a message to the mysterious listeners. Then the traveler grabs his horse and hightails it out of the whole spooky situation. Let's take a closer look at what makes this poem so effective. The themes. There are basically two main themes of the poem. The first one is mystery, understanding, and the unknown. The listeners draws much of its eerie quality from the fact that its meaning is rather opaque. The poem, in many ways, defies interpretation precisely because it is about the unknown and the unknowable. Somewhat paradoxically, the listeners acknowledges people's desires to seek understanding while also asserting a certain insurmountable mystery of the world around them. In short, the poem suggests that people cannot always find the answers they seek, regardless of how hard they look. I hope I've tried to, write things down in the simplest manner for your understanding. I hope it will be an easy explanation for you. The second theme of the poem is isolation and loneliness. Beyond underscoring the innate unknowability of the world, the listener seems to reflect the existential loneliness that results from such mystery. Have you ever experienced it yourself? Being alone in a house, you feel a deep, saddened loneliness. So exactly that is what is being, catered to over here. The poem creates a distinction between its isolated human subject, the natural world surrounding the abandoned home, and the spirits who do not answer the traveler's call. Taken allegorically, symbolically that is, the poem's opening line, "Is anybody there?" could be read as an echo of humankind's call to an absent God. Okay, just like Allama Iqbal keeps referring in his poems to the unseen God. Similarly, Walter de la Mare has, in a way, symbolized the opening statement of the poem to be referring maybe to the God whom we cannot see. Ultimately, through the poem's evocation of human loneliness, it suggests the indifference of the universe to people's search for connection and meaning. The setting. The setting of the listeners is a house in a forest at night. Clues to the setting are revealed subtly at the beginning of the poem as the traveler arrives. He knocks on a moonlit door, showing both that it is nighttime and that he has arrived at a house. Meanwhile, his horse grazes on the forest's ferny floor, which demonstrates that the house is in a wood and that the area around it has become overgrown. The characters. The characters in the poem start out normal but get progressively more mysterious. There's the first one is a traveler who's just a typical man, and maybe you could consider the horse a character as well. The other characters in the poem are decidedly less concrete. That is, they are abstract. You cannot see them. The listeners are an ill-defined group that listen but don't respond to the traveler's call. Are they ghosts? Words like phantom seem to indicate so. The listeners hear that voice from the world of men, which seems to imply that they are of a different world. The imagery of the listeners thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall, brings to mind a haunted house filled with spirits. Finally, and most enigmatically, are the characters referred to as them. The traveler calls out to the listeners, "Tell them I came," and no one answered, "that I kept my word." Now we really have a mystery. Who are them exactly? Why had the traveler promised to come to them? And why aren't they there now? Even if we are pretty sure the listeners are ghosts, it's anybody's guess as to who the them refers to. If anything seems clueless to you right now, if anything seems ambiguous to you right now, whatever I've listed over here, whatever I'm speaking, you will tend to understand it once we will read the poem. I just wanted to go through all these important points before we started off with the poem and the explanation. Okay? I'll give you a short summary. These summaries I have taken from two different places. The first one is from a site called Study Guide, and the second one is by an educator, Damatsuko. Okay? So according to the Study Guide, a traveler comes to knock on the moonlit door of a house in an unknown place. The traveler hopes to keep an unknown promise by coming, but no one answers his knocks at the door, though the poem describes a host of phantom listeners inside, and he leaves. The poem describes the anxiety and dislocation of modern life in which people are alienated from the natural world. According to Damatsuko, the listeners describe a traveler who has come to knock on a moonlit door in an eerie, unknown place. He has come to keep an unnamed promise and knocks on the door harder and harder, but gets no response. Unbeknownst to him, a host of phantom listeners, in line number 13, are inside but unresponsive to his calls. The traveler finally leaves, but the listeners remain. Now I'd like to read on to the poem. I'd like you to open up to page 63 and read along with me. Here I have given you line-wise, I'll be reading chunks of the poem and giving explanation. The Listeners by Walter de la Mare. "Is there anybody there?" said the traveller, knocking on the moonlit door, and his horse in the silence champed the grasses off the forest's ferny floor. An unnamed figure, the traveller, knocks on the door of a house in the moonlight and asks if there is anyone inside. The traveller's horse grazes in the quiet forest while the traveller waits for a response. And a bird flew up out of the turret above the traveller's head. A bird flies out of a small tower on the house and over the traveller's head. And he smote upon the door again, a second time. "Is there anybody there?" he said. The traveller knocks again. Smote me is an old English word. It means to knock hard. The traveller knocks again more forcefully and repeats his question. But no one descended to the traveller. No head from the leaf-fringed sill leaned over and looked into his grey eyes. No one comes down from the house to meet him. However, no one even leans out of the window, the sill of which is covered in leaves, to look at him. Sill is the extended portion of the window on which mostly people place plants, etc., to decorate, for decorative purposes. Where he stood perplexed and still, he stands in place, puzzled by the lack of an answer. Why do you think he's puzzled? Because he was expecting people to be inside the house. Instead, there is silence. But only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men. Inside the house is a group of ghostly beings. These listeners stand in the moonlight as they listen to the human voice coming from outside. Stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stairs that goes down to the empty, empty hall, hearkening in an air stirred and shaken by the lonely traveller's call. The ghostly beings crowd around the staircase onto which moonlight streaks, as the quiet atmosphere in the empty house is disturbed by the sound of the traveller's lonely voice. And he felt in his heart their strangeness, their stillness answering his cry. Outside, the traveller senses a strange presence in the silence that meets his question. While his horse moved, cropping the dark turf neath the starred and leafy sky, his horse, undisturbed by all of this, continues to graze in the dark forest. The sky above it is full of stars and obscured by trees. For he suddenly smote on the door even louder and lifted his head. "Tell them I came, and no one answered, that I kept my word," he said. The traveller suddenly beats on the door once again, even more loudly than before. He then calls out, asking whoever is listening to pass on a message that no one answered him when he came to the house, but he kept his promise. Never the least stir made the listeners, though every word he spake fell echoing through the shadowiness of the still house, for the one man left awake. The listeners don't make any motion in response to this. The traveller's words reverberate, that is, echo, through the dark, empty house, coming from the only living person around, that is, the traveller. Ay, they heard his foot upon the stirrup, and the sound of iron on stone, and how the silence surged softly backward when the plunging hoofs were gone. The phantom listeners hear him jump up onto his horse, and then the sound of the horseshoes on the stone path as the traveller rides away. The silence of the forest quickly returns as the sound of the horse's forceful riding fades away. Now, before we move any further, there was this word champing. Champing, like the word chomping, refers to chewing, particularly by horses and similar animals. It's an onomatopoeic word mimicking the action with its sound. We know that onomatopoeia are words that mimic the action using the sound. It can also signify impatience, as in the phrase champing at the bit. In this poem, its presence is simpler, only serving to place the horse as a representative of the natural world, doing a mundane thing, a normal thing that horses do. Now, the poetic devices used in the poem, there's a long list of poetic devices, but I want to cover them all. First of all is the rhyme scheme. The rhyme scheme of the poem is A, B, C, D. How does this work? I'll let you know. Wait up. Okay. If you see over here, traveler will be A. Do will be B. O. Okay? Traveler, door, or. Is a different sound, O is a different sound. So this is going to be A, this is going to be B. Do I have a pen over here? Yes, I do. This is going to be A, and this is going to be B. This sound is C, and again this sound is B. So our rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B. Okay? So this is how we're going to move on. All right. Now, the rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B. The poem uses strong rhymes of single syllable words for most of the poem. The poet ends the poem on a near rhyme. Stone, gone. I'll show you this. Stone. Oh, what happened? Where did my pen go? Okay. Stone, gone. Okay, so own. Again, B. Okay, up, A, B. Ard is C, so it's A, B, C, B. Stone, gone. Okay. Now, the poet uses strong rhymes of single syllable words for most of the poem. He ends the poem on a near rhyme, stone, gone, which is a technique that creates less certainty and corresponds to the unresolved feeling the poem imparts. Now, the second poetic device is alliteration. Alliteration is, again, the repetition of the initial consonant sound. Here I've given you a few examples. Forests, ferny, floor. The F sound is being repeated. Louder and lifted. L, l. His head. H, h. And again, to create, since the whole atmosphere of the poem is very suspenseful, and suspense is created through silence, and for the word for silence, the sound that comes in your mind is s. So silence surges softly. Okay. Onomatopoeia, again with the word champed. Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. Incidenton is basically when you omit certain words from the normal writing. By omitting the word and from the phrase there's strangeness, there's stillness. Instead of saying there's strangeness and there's stillness, the word and has been omitted and incidenton has been created. Strong imageries are created throughout the poem. A strong visual picture with descriptions such as thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair. A clear picture of moonbeams falling onto the dark stairs is created in your mind. Neath, overhead. This is again incidenton. Beneath, instead of writing the word beneath, he's written neath. He's used the word neath. Neath the star and leafy sky. You can clearly create a picture of a starry sky, night sky, and a lot of foliage from the trees. Plunging hooves. You can clearly create a picture of the hooves, moving hooves of the horse. Now, dialogue. There's a lot of, you see, the repetition of the initial dialogue. Is anybody there? And then later on, he says, let them know that I came, I kept my promise. That's a dialogue, okay? Point of view. The poem allows the reader to experience the action from the perspective not only of the traveler, but also of the phantom listeners. Okay, the poem does not give you only the perspective of the traveler, that the traveler is knocking and asking questions, but also from the perspective of the phantoms that are living inside, because they have heard the only living person knocking on their door. Suspense is created. Suspense is created. The fact that the reader knows what the traveler doesn't creates suspense. What do we know? We know that there are phantoms living inside the house. Do you think the traveler knows? No. he doesn't. So that creates suspense. Anaphora. Anaphora is a deliberate repetition of the first part of the sentence in order to achieve an artistic effect. In The Listeners, I like the anaphora because it relates to the alliteration I spoke of earlier. Stood. The word stood. Notice the use. Stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men. Stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair. Look at how the word stood is being repeated. And then the repetition of the dialogue. Is anybody there? Thrice creates a lot of anaphora, repetition, to create effect of suspense, probably, the eerie effect that remains throughout the poem. The last poetic device, which needs a lot of explanation since it's there, is the metaphor. The poem doesn't make extensive use of metaphors. There is a metaphor about halfway through the poem, though. Hearkening in an air stirred and shaken. In the above line, air is being compared to something that could be stirred and shaken. What do you think can be stirred and shaken? Water? Yes, probably. Juice? Yes. Air can be diffused and blown, but it is not something that can be picked up in order to shake. So, a metaphor. The most significant metaphor in the poem is the one that suggests that phantom listeners exist in the poem. In the house, where the narrator comes to knock and receives no response. Silence or emptiness thus becomes identified with phantoms in an extended metaphor. Here's the example or the extract. But only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men. The comparison of silence or emptiness to phantoms is used for a large portion of the poem. If you move over to page number 64, you can see that the poem uses archaic language. Archaic language, pronounced archaic, is the name given to words which are no longer used. 19th and early 20th century poets often used such language on purpose because it was felt to be appropriate for poetry at that time. Poets may also use archaic language to give their poems a feeling of times long gone. Now, a few archaic words which have been used are smote. In line 7 and 25, it is the past tense to smite, which means to hit. It is usually used in the old-fashioned expression to smite one's enemies or to smite with a sword. In the poem, the traveler smote upon the door, which in simpler language means that he knocked hard on the door. Hearkening, line 19, listening to. Hark means listen. Remember this word because when we will do Shakespeare, Hamlet, we're going to come across this word over there. Hark means listen. A famous line from Shakespeare's play Chamberlain welcomes the dawn with these words. Hark, hark the lark at heaven's gates sings. Neath, in line number 24, stands for the word beneath, which means under. The apostrophe indicates that the first two letters of beneath have been omitted. Spake, in line 30, is the archaic form of the word spoke, the simple past tense of to speak. A or I, line 33, it means yes or yes indeed. A is used today in Scotland to mean yes. You must have heard aye, but aye, sir, or yes, sir, but it is pronounced as both I or a. Take it? Right, we move on. On page number 64 and 65, you have your vocabulary exercise, which asks you for synonyms from the poem. The expressions are given over here. These are the words that have been asked, and these are the words that you have to look up from the poem for these words, okay? The answers to your vocabulary exercise are already given. This time, since I have given you a lot of explanation, I would like you guys to do the exercise on your own. There are 7, 10, 11 questions, and they are very simple, to the point answers, simple as it is. Okay, that's all that I expect from you. This time, I want you to attempt the questions on your own, and I hope I have answered all the questions that are here in the lesson. If there is anything that needs explanation, you can always ask, okay, in the comment section, and I'll be ready to help you out. With that, we come to the end of our lesson. I think this much is enough for today. Thank you all. Remain safe and happy learning. I love you all so much. Thank you.